skin peeled off, bodies stuffed inside donkeys, victims turned into human candles. The Roman Empire gave the world law, order, and infrastructure, but it also gave us torture that seems like it was designed in hell. And it wasn't hidden behind closed doors. It was theater. People bought tickets to watch this. Families brought their children. Senators sipped wine while someone screamed to death in the arena. These were the 10 most horrifying torture methods ever practiced in ancient Rome. And just when you think it can't get worse, it does. Flaying, skinned alive for hours. Let's start with one of the oldest and slowest forms of Roman punishment, flaying. The skin wasn't just removed, it was peeled. Carefully, slowly, with the precision of a butcher slicing prosciutto. The idea was simple: keep the victim alive long enough to feel everything. Executioners often began at the scalp, cutting around the hairline, then pulling downward. Hot water was sometimes poured onto the skin first to loosen it. Knives then followed veins, slicing between flesh and fat, lifting away the skin like a sheet. Sometimes, the victim was strung up in the forum for all to see, bleeding, exposed, barely conscious. If they were lucky, they passed out from shock. If not, they'd remain awake for hours, even days. Roman writers like Lucan and Suetonius described flaying as a punishment for traitors and enemy spies. But it wasn't just about justice. It was about making an example, about turning a body into a public warning. Damnatio ad bestias, fed to wild beasts. You've probably heard of gladiators fighting lions, but this was no fight. This was an execution. Damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts, was used for Rome's worst criminals, political enemies, and later, for Christians. Victims were thrown into arenas with starved animals, lions, tigers, leopards, even wild boars. But here's the twist. Sometimes, victims weren't just thrown in. They were prepared. Some were tied to stakes and covered in blood or animal guts to entice the beasts. Others had grain sewn into their intestines to attract pigs. The idea was to provoke the animals into savagery, because the more gruesome the death, the better the show. Children were not spared, nor were the elderly, and the audience, they cheered. Sometimes they demanded the animals be pulled back, just so the execution could start again. Crushed by elephants. The Romans admired elephants. They saw them used in Eastern warfare, especially by the Carthaginians. But Rome also found another use for them: execution. A condemned man would be led into an open square, kneeling before a massive armored elephant. With a single command, the beast would raise its foot and bring it crashing down. And not just anywhere. Roman executioners trained elephants to aim specifically for the skull, chest, or limbs. They wanted to crush the body in stages. First a leg, then an arm, then finally, the head. Sometimes victims were staked to the ground, and the elephant was instructed to dance, stepping lightly around the body, only to crush it suddenly with a fatal stomp. It was a psychological torment. You never knew when the foot would fall. Rat cauldron torture. This one is the stuff of nightmares. A large metal bowl or cauldron was filled with starved rats. Filthy, desperate, wild-eyed creatures driven half-mad by hunger. The open side of the cauldron was strapped tightly to a victim's bare stomach or chest. Then, without hesitation, the top of the bowl was heated. Sometimes with glowing coals placed directly on top, other times with an open flame held steadily against the metal. The result was predictable. The metal grew hotter. The rats panicked. And then, they began to dig. Claws and teeth shredded flesh in a frenzy. There was no escape except forward, into the only soft surface available, the human body beneath them. They didn't hesitate. Skin was torn open within seconds. Muscle followed. Then organs. The rats clawed and chewed their way through the victim's abdomen, searching for escape, propelled by primal terror. Screams burst from the victim's mouth, but they were often drowned out by the horrifying sounds coming from within, scratching, squirming, and the wet crunch of internal flesh being devoured. Sometimes the rats didn't kill quickly. Some victims were kept alive for hours, even as their entrails were gnawed apart. The mental torture was as excruciating as the physical. To feel something alive moving and eating inside your own body was a descent into madness. This wasn't just a form of punishment, it was psychological warfare. Roman authorities used it during interrogations to extract confessions. Warlords deployed it against enemies to inspire fear. And in private vendettas, it became the ultimate tool of personal revenge, a statement of absolute cruelty. It was never about efficiency. It was about sending a message. You will suffer, and it will be remembered. Stuffed inside a donkey corpse. Yes, you heard that right. A literal donkey. This method wasn't common, but when it was used, it was unforgettable. First, a donkey or horse would be gutted, its organs removed, leaving behind a hollow carcass. The condemned was then stripped naked and forced inside the dead animal. Their arms and legs were folded unnaturally, and the belly of the beast was stitched shut. The corpse was left in the sun. Within hours, the heat began cooking both the animal and the human inside. The stench attracted flies, maggots, and vultures. Worms burrowed through the animal's flesh, and eventually into the human. Death came from suffocation, heat, infection, or the simple horror of being eaten alive inside a rotting beast. This punishment was typically reserved for enemy generals or traitors of the highest degree. Because it didn't just kill the victim, it erased their dignity, their image, and their legacy. Nailed inside barrels. This method was a twisted form of biological warfare on a single person. The condemned was fed a mixture of honey, milk, and spoiled meat. They were then stripped naked, smeared in honey, and forced inside a wooden barrel or box with only their heads sticking out. The box was sealed and left in the sun. What happened next was horrifying. The honey and milk attracted swarms of flies, wasps, and parasites. The spoiled meat caused intense diarrhea which pooled inside the barrel. Worms, maggots, and biting insects infested the victim's flesh. They couldn't move, couldn't scratch, couldn't scream loud enough. Death came from gangrene, dehydration, septic shock, or sheer madness. This wasn't just a punishment, it was a slow-motion death sentence lasting 5 to 10 days. The bee basket. Imagine this. You're tied upside down from a tree. Below you, a woven basket full of agitated bees. The basket is opened just enough for the bees to fly upward, directly into your face, your ears, your mouth. This was the bee torture. And in certain Roman provinces, it was considered more than just punishment. It was poetic justice. Victims were often accused of theft, particularly the theft of honey, or of tampering with royal apiaries. In communities that relied on bees for trade, pollination, and ritual offerings, harming a hive wasn't just vandalism, it was sacrilege. The sentence? Simple. You steal from the bees, you face the bees. The process was slow and terrifying. Victims were suspended for hours, sometimes days, while a smoke-soaked cloth was waved to keep the bees agitated but not dispersed. Their stingers tore into soft tissue, lips, eyelids, nostrils. Each sting injected venom, causing massive swelling. The eyes swelled shut. The throat thickened until even breathing became a fight. Some tried to scream, only to choke as bees flew into their mouths. This was torture by nature, harnessed with precision. The Romans didn't just rely on brute force. They understood psychological horror, the helplessness, the buzzing, the constant threat of another sting, another flare of pain. Death came in stages. Some suffocated as their airways swelled shut. Others went into anaphylactic shock. And a few, perhaps the unluckiest, survived the ordeal, only to die from infection days later, swollen, feverish, covered in sores. To the Romans, this punishment sent a clear message: betray the hive, become its victim. And unlike more theatrical executions, this one didn't need a crowd. The forest buzzed. The bees screamed for them. Poena culae, the sack of death. Rome reserved one of its most theatrical executions for one of its most heinous crimes: parricide, or the murder of one's own parent. The sentence? Poena culae, the penalty of the sack. First, the guilty party was stripped, beaten, and sewn into a large leather sack. But they weren't alone. Inside the sack were 4 animals: a monkey, a rooster, a snake, and a dog. Why those animals? Each one symbolized chaos, betrayal, madness, and evil. And once the sack was sewn shut, it was tossed into a river. What happened inside that sack is left to the imagination. Biting, scratching, strangling, all while the sack filled with water. Drowning became the final mercy. This punishment was so feared that Roman children grew up with it as a bedtime warning. Honor your parents, or sleep in the sack. Castration and public disembowelment. For certain crimes, especially sexual offenses against nobility, Romans turned to mutilation, and they made sure it happened in public. Castration wasn't clean. It wasn't done in silence or with mercy. It was performed with a hooked blade, rusted from use, and wielded not by surgeons, but by executioners trained in cruelty. The victim was dragged into the forum, stripped naked, and tied to a wooden post. No anesthesia, just ropes to keep them still, and soldiers to ensure they didn't faint too quickly. The screams weren't a side effect. They were part of the experience. The crowd gathered to hear them, to watch every slash and every convulsion. Blood soaked the earth. The crowd sometimes jeered, sometimes laughed. Sometimes children sat on their fathers' shoulders to get a better view. But in some cases, that wasn't the end. After the genitals were severed, the condemned might be disemboweled while still alive. A sharp incision was made across the abdomen, just deep enough to open the body without killing immediately. Then, with hands or tools, the executioners pulled out the intestines, foot after foot, letting them coil onto the ground like grotesque ropes. Birds were sometimes released nearby, crows, vultures, or ravens. They pecked at the exposed organs as they twitched. And the crowd? They leaned in. The closer they stood, the better the spectacle. This punishment wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. It said, violate Rome's moral code, especially its elite, and Rome will strip you of everything, your pride, your manhood, your life, piece by piece. For the Romans, justice wasn't just served cold. Sometimes it was served screaming, bleeding, and gasping for breath, under the open sky in the heart of the empire. The Roman candle, lit alive. No list of Roman torture would be complete without this final horror. It's been whispered in early Christian texts, echoed in Roman chronicles, and retold for centuries in hushed tones. But even now, it sounds too brutal to be real. Under the reign of Emperor Nero, Rome became a theater of cruelty. After the Great Fire of 64 AD reduced much of the city to ash, the public turned against their emperor, accusing him of starting the blaze to clear space for his new palace. Desperate to deflect blame, Nero pointed his finger at a small, unpopular group: the Christians. What followed was not just persecution, it was performance. Men, women, and even teenagers were rounded up, accused of arson without evidence. They were imprisoned, tortured, and ultimately brought to Nero's private gardens for an execution unlike any other. At twilight, the spectacle began. The condemned were stripped of their clothes, their bodies smeared with pitch, tar, or oil, highly flammable substances that clung to the skin. Then they were tied upright to wooden stakes planted across the gardens. As darkness fell, Nero gave the signal. Torches were brought forward, flames touched flesh, and they burned. Screams echoed through the hedges. The smell of roasted human flesh filled the air. But to Nero and his elite guests, it was ambiance. The gardens were transformed into a macabre carnival, lit not by lanterns, but by human candles. Banquets were held. Musicians played lyres and flutes. Wine flowed. This wasn't justice, this was sadism wrapped in ceremony. Some ancient sources claim Nero wept as he watched. But not from guilt or pity. He cried, they said, because the human torches flickered out too quickly. Because even death to Nero was entertainment. Rome prided itself on being the most advanced civilization of the ancient world, and in many ways it was. But when it came to pain, Rome wasn't just advanced, it was creative. Its punishments weren't about quick death. They were about fear. Fear that kept people in line, fear that controlled empires, fear that outlived the victims themselves. So the next time you hear someone say, Rome was civilized, ask them how civilized a donkey corpse full of human organs really is. And if this video scarred you a little, wait until you see what the Aztecs did to their enemies. Click here for that horror show. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and maybe sleep with the lights on tonight. Which one of these tortures haunted you the most? Drop it in the comments below.